Hello friends, and thank you for joining us on this very fine radio station. We thought we'd do something a little bit different today. We thought we'd have a discussion, both James and myself, on some of the popes of the 20th century. And I'd like to start with Pope Pius XII.
Hitler's Pope, of course.
Yes, that's right. Eugene Pacelli, of course. I have two images of Eugene Pacelli. The first one is the famous photograph taken in the Second World War when the Americans mistakenly bombed part of Rome, and Pacelli, or Pius XII as he was called, went to visit the ruins. Of course, a vast crowd gathered, and he actually climbed in the rubble and looked shocked at what happened. And apparently nobody was killed, but there was extensive damage. And there's this famous picture of him with his wearing his white cassock and his long white overcoat over the cassock, and he's holding up his hands and he's looking up to heaven. There's a crowd standing round him, and of course the cassock is smeared with rubble and concrete. So that's the image I have of him from that wartime.
Also, you were mentioning a while ago that you went to Rome in 1968.
Correct.
And you had the opportunity of going into the Vatican. Tell us the image that you came across.
Well, that's right. 1968, the Vatican commissioned a German sculptor, I don't know who it was, to do a bas-relief of Pope Pius XII. And when I went to Rome in 68, I went to St. Peter's to see it. The funny thing is that I couldn't find it. All the other popes were very visible there with their statues, particularly the Michelangelo and others in marble and so forth. But the one of Pius XII was slightly hidden away down some corridors on the side of St. Peter's. But I did find it. Very strange depiction of him standing there. It's in black. I think it's probably lead or something. It's been finely polished. And of course he's standing there with this white cassock on. He's looking towards... No, he's not looking. He should be looking towards the public in front of him. He's holding his hand up to do a blessing, but instead his head is turned towards his left shoulder, and he's actually looking over his left shoulder. But it's the look of terror and fear on his face. And I actually went round there and climbed up on something and looked at this face. Somebody thought that as he was looking over his left shoulder, he was looking at the hordes of communists who were marching to destroy his beloved church. And so much of them have got in there since Vatican II, when you look at the German theologians and bishops and so forth.
So what are we to make of Pius's involvement with Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler?
Well, I don't know if you know it or not, but he was the nuncio in Germany just after the First World War, and he was to stay there all through the 20s, and he was certainly there for the rise of Nazism. Indeed, he knew many of the Nazi leaders. But I'd like to tell a little quick story just about 1919, when I think he was in, I think it was Cologne, I'm not sure, he was the nuncio there, and a communist mob actually stormed the nuncio's residence and burst into his study. He heard them coming, of course, heard the shouting and everything, and this was told by his secretary, his housekeeper, and one of these young communists walked up to him, took his pistol out, put it against Pacelli's head, looked him in the eye and said, "Today you will die." And of course I think Archbishop Pacelli thought he was going, and he pulled the trigger and it went click, and he looked at him and smiled. "Today you live." And they all ransacked the place and run out. She says that Archbishop Pacelli collapsed onto the chair, possibly had a nervous breakdown. He certainly recovered physically, but I think his nerve was shattered that day. But later on, of course, he went back to the Vatican, and as you know, he was the Secretary of State under Pope Pius XI. And of course, at the outbreak of war, he was voted in as the new Pope.
Well, please join us tomorrow for a look at John the 23rd, better known as
Good Pope John. Hello friends, and thank you for joining us again on this very fine radio station. Well, we're continuing our discussion on the popes of the 20th century. We looked at Pius XII. Today we're going to look at a man who was an unexpected choice of pope, and that was John the 23rd.
Now, John the 23rd is a very interesting character. He came into the role of pontiff quite late in his life, and I think Vatican insiders thought this old boy would have very little input in Vatican affairs, but of course
They called him the caretaker pope.
Yes, but of course he launched Vatican II.
Yes.
Please tell us about Roncalli's involvement with Vatican II, and also with his links to Rosicrucianism, please.
Well, Angelo Roncalli was a surprise choice as Pope when Pius died in 1958. Pius did actually 19 years. He was the Pope from Venice. He was a very elderly Pope by then. I think he was about 78, 79. But he was the surprise choice. Many saw him as a caretaker Pope, and he was actually only to do, I think, 5 years. I think he finished in 1963. But Angelo Roncalli had a hidden agenda, from what I can make out, and through various authors who've written about him. He was actually apostolic delegate in Bulgaria during the war, not full nuncio, and he did some remarkable work there for the Jews that were in those countries, both those countries. Only a small minority of Jews, but he was very good in distributing passports, and he didn't expect them to be baptized Catholic either. When he became Pope in 1958, I think a lot of people thought everything would carry on very much as it had under the previous Pope. But in 1960 he called all the bishops to Rome, do you remember this? And he summoned what is called the Second Vatican Council. A lot of opposition at the time, and I remember the American Cardinal, Cardinal Spellman in New York, saying, "Why are we going to Rome? If the bike ain't broken, why are we going to mend it?" But eventually he got his own way, and the Second Vatican Council began, I think, in 1961. Interestingly enough, he has been accused of being a member of the Rosicrucians, or the Priory of Zion. Very fashionable at the moment and very controversial with this new Dan Brown book, of course.
And please recall the story of, I think he received his skull cap when he was nuncio.
Yes, that's true. The interesting thing about him was, as I say, he was an apostolic delegate in Bulgaria, way down the diplomatic line, but he seemed to leapfrog from that post there to become nuncio in Paris at the end of the Second World War, which he did, of course, and he became nuncio primarily to solve the problem of the Catholic bishops who had been collaborators, of course, when the Germans occupied France. And instead of going to Rome to receive the red hat, as they call it, the biretta, he was given to this by the President of France, Michel Vincent Auriol. Nothing remarkable about him except that he was a communist, and as a communist he was also an atheist, and there he gave the red hat to Archbishop Pacelli.
And we should just say that this is unprecedented.
Absolutely.
We don't normally have secular states awarding priests with caps.
Most cardinals will journey to Rome to be given the cap, the red cap, or the red hat as they call it, by the Pope. Roncalli broke tradition, whether it was his choice or not, but he obviously did it.
And just one final question. What do we make of his role in the Second Vatican Council? Was he aware of the damage that it would do, and how much disunity it caused?
Oh yes, absolutely. I'm pretty sure this was the whole agenda. I think he passed it over to the German mafia, as they call people like Archbishop Bayer or Cardinal Bayer, who incidentally was Pope Pius XII's confessor. You had the German bishops, Archbishop Frings of Cologne, Cardinal Koenig of Vienna, and some very feisty, hard theologians working under them, somebody by the name of Joseph Ratzinger and Hans Küng. They're only monsignors then, but between the two of them and the rest of the support of the German church and the Dutch church, the Catholic Church would never be the same again. It swung completely to the left.
Well, thank you very much for that input. Please join us for tomorrow's broadcast, where we cover Pope Paul VI.
Thank you, friends, for joining us on this very fine radio station. Well, we're continuing our feature on the popes of the 20th century, and today I think we're at
Pope Paul VI.
Pope Paul VI.
And I'd like to start by asking you the story of when the new Mass was brought to him, how it sat on his desk for 6 years, I believe.
If I could just go back with the death of John the 23rd, I remember straight away it was rumoured that the new Pope would be Cardinal Montini, as I should say, of Milan. He was the absolute choice for the job, and strangely enough, he was voted in Pope on the first ballot. Yes, the new Mass. Somebody once said of Pope Paul VI was that he was like Hamlet. He couldn't make a decision, which probably in your life and mine, it's not too bad. We have days to plan what we're going to do and to make decisions. But this poor man, with all the upheavals of Vatican II and many of the decisions which I don't think he was very fond of, and certainly did all he could possibly to obstruct. But one of the decisions that came out is that the old Latin Tridentine Mass would be shaved down from, I think, about 40 minutes to about 17 17 minutes. And the Mass was brought to him, and it was placed on his desk to get his approval for this new Mass to be said in the vernacular of each country. And it sat there, I think, well, we're told, for 6 years. The interesting thing was the man who was given the job of putting this Mass together, Archbishop Annibale Bugnani. Bugnani, of course, we now know was a prominent Freemason, a member of P2, just the man to bring in the new Mass. He seems to have fallen out with Paul after that, because he was sent off as nuncio to the least Catholic country, which I think is Iran, and I think it was about 400 Catholics there. Was he a Freemason? Did he push a Masonic agenda? Well, many think he did, and I don't know about that, but yes, that's true. It sat on his desk. Yes, he went to the United Nations, gave his speech. He met Lyndon Johnson. Of course, the old joke was at the end of it, as Lyndon Johnson shook his hand, said, "You must come again. Next time, bring the wife." But there was a story that in the United Nations building, and I'm not at all surprised, is a room devoted primarily to the to the god Horus or Satan, and it has this Luciferian eye there within a pyramid. Paul knew all about this, and he actually wanted to see this.
I'd just like to say one thing while we're on the subject, that if anybody sees the United Nations floor, it is a black and white Masonic floor. They put a carpet over this, but it's still there. The same floor you'll see in Downing Street, and of course St Paul's Cathedral, so it is a Masonic connection. So please carry on.
Well, it's owned by am I right, there's the Rockefellers or the Rothschilds?
I believe that the Rockefellers have leased it to the US government.
Who leased it to the UN government, so of course they're still the landlords, and of course they still own it. I know a lot of Americans resent having this on American soil, but if there is a temple there, and that's what it would be to Lucifer or Satan, then I'm afraid it is going to be destroyed. And I remember one well-known writer from Pensacola saying that when the second coming comes, the United Nations building would be destroyed in the first 12 minutes.
Well, thank you very much for that. Please join us tomorrow for a look at Pope John Paul I, the Pope for 33 days.
Hello, friends, and thank you for joining us once again on this very fine radio station. Well, we're still continuing our journey and looking at the lives of the popes of the 20th century, and I think today we've got to
John Paul I.
The Smiling Pope, as the media named him, and he looked very refreshing after the sort of painful Pope Paul VI.
Of course, Luciani was not the first ideal person to take over the pontificate of Paul VI. He was a surprise to many, and sadly for him, he only lasted 33 days.
He'd also come from Venice, like John the 23rd has, and I think that's interesting as well.
What are we to make of this smiling pontiff?
The smiling pontiff.
Good guy, bad guy?
Well, yes, the smiling pontiff, and I remember it was the year of the little girl in England. The mother conceived the child by a test tube baby, Louise, and he thought this was a wonderful thing. Of course, it absolutely shocked the Conservatives and the Catholic Church. I don't know. I mean, certainly he had socialist roots. His father was a socialist, of course, and may well have been a communist. He was very much in line with the plight of the poor. He lived very simply. I don't think he lived in the Archbishop's house in Venice, and I think his secretary said, he was a very simple man. I'm sure he was. He went to South America, to Brazil, and was appalled by what he saw there. I think he was even more appalled when he saw that the Vatican owned vast slum properties in, I think it was Argentina, and I think he said, if I were Pope, I'd do something about this.
I think we should also say that when he first came Pope, he used the same bedroom, the same bed, and the same linen from Paul VI.
Well, I think you know the story better than me, that you can say that he actually slept in Paul's sheets, and
he comes across as a very humble man. I mean, I would say the wrong man for the wrong job, quite honestly. I think he was in the wrong church as well.
Wrong man, absolutely wrong man for the wrong church. But you see, this is the way the Catholic Church had got then, you see. They'd become very political through the justice and peace movement. So, of course, you had this social gospel, and, of course, you had this gospel where, you had to support the poor, which of course you should do, but of course they were supporting Marxist guerrillas through the World Council of Churches, and a sort of bringing these people into the religious system. And these people certainly weren't Christians, they were atheists, most of them. They were certainly Marxists.
Now, of course, we must mention that his own family disputed the Vatican's account of how Luciano died. Poison has been suggested by many Catholic insiders. What is your view on this Pope's death?
I think the jury's still out on this. I haven't made my mind up one way or another. I think the whole thing is very suspicious, and I know you watched a programme only a few weeks ago on the Discovery Channel, in which I think they said the jury was still out on it.
I think what's interesting is that he was embalmed very soon after dying.
Yeah.
You have Cardinal Villo at 5 o'clock in the morning walking around...
A Freemason, may I say.
Walking around the Vatican grounds with his full regalia on, which of course was very unusual for this person. And again, I say the family of John Paul I did reject the Vatican statement that he died of natural causes.
And I seem to remember the nun who'd been in for many, many years. Wasn't she shipped out next day somewhere? And
I believe all his staff were.
never heard. The one who did well was his secretary, Father McGee, who later became Archbishop McGee, and he's the Archbishop in Athlone.
The Vatican's official line is that he was found dead in bed reading Thomas à Kempis's Imitations of Christ.
And shouldn't every pope be reading that in bed?
But what we're not too sure about was whether or not he was going to disband the Jesuits, sell off the Vatican banks, and try and take the Roman Catholic Church back to its traditional biblical roots. We're not sure.
Well, I think he may well have had that plan. I think he may well have discussed it with people who he thought were friends in the Catholic Church, who also let us get back to the traditional, the curia of the Church, the government of the Church. And no way would they let this happen. But yes, the smiling Pope of 33 days.
Please join us tomorrow as we cover Pope John Paul II.
Thank you. Well, we're still making our clerical journey, should I say, amongst the popes of the 20th century. And today we come to the Pope from Poland.
And what would you like to share with us today about this Pope from Poland?
Well, Karol Wojtyla, I don't know if people know this or not, but his great ambition as a child was to be an actor and also to be a poet. I've actually read some of his poems, and I think they're very, very good. I think when he became Pope, he obviously had the greatest part in his life, playing the Pope, and he played it very, very well for 27 years, was it 28 years? Very, very long time. And he certainly caught the imagination of the world. I mean, look at his lying in state and the slow death process on television.
We should just back up to when he became Pope, how we thought that his colleague in Warsaw actually doubted the authenticity and integrity of Karol Wojtyla.
Well, of course, Karol Wojtyla was the Pope of Krakow, and he was the number two in Poland. Of course, the number one Pope was the sort of the hero of the Pope of the Polish, Cardinal Stefan Wyszynski. Wyszynski was a tough guy. I mean, he had seen the Germans out and been roughed up by the Gestapo, and then, of course, he saw the back of the Germans, and then marched the Russians, and was back in the cells again. So he had a rough time. But there'd always been this rumour that he suspected, I don't know if it's been confirmed or not, that Karol Wojtyla was a spy in the pay of the Polish secret police. Certainly Wojtyla never got arrested as Wyszynski did. He certainly had doubts about him, yeah.
Now, we should also say that when this Pope died back in April 2005, we were somewhat surprised and also very disappointed to see 3 American presidents.
Wasn't that amazing?
Present at his funeral, with all 3 of them kneeling down at a dead corpse's body.
Well, I thought it was absolutely amazing. You had this dead Pope carried through the square. I mean, by then his skin had turned to sort of grey. He looked absolutely appalling, I thought. He was carried through there, placed in St. Peter's. We were told the American president was come, and lo and behold, who should come walking in but 3 presidents, along with the Secretary of State, who then knelt before the body or the corpse and went into prayer.
Of course, the biggest problem that John Paul II had to deal with was the paedophilia problem with the priests in America and around the world. We should also say that he did cover it up for many, many years, and eventually accept the resignation of Bernard Law only after much pressure from the American dioceses. Please add some light to this.
Well, may I say that I think the stain of the paedophiles in the Catholic Church will remain. It certainly cost them millions of dollars worldwide, but the stain, the respect that the Catholic Church had, has gone forever now. Too many of these cases are coming out the woodwork, and quite rightly so, but the Vatican covered so much of it up.
And we should also say that we know of several priests in the diocese that we used to be part of who unfortunately are still practicing priests and have been moved around with the knowledge of the bishop, and they haven't been suspended or dismissed from the priesthood.
I'm sure this happens in most countries. They're moved around from one end of the country to the next. It's a quick way of doing it. And of course, they arrive in a parish in the middle of nowhere and nobody knows them at all. I don't think it's that easy to get away with now, but I'm sure they will do it if they can.
And we should also say that this Pope made a comment in 2001 to the Los Angeles Times to the fact that anybody who leads a good life will get to heaven. Now, this is a very interesting statement to make, because the Catholic Church still holds to the need for the Catholic to go to Mass, receive the sacraments and go to confession, and not to die in mortal sin. Yet the same pontiff was telling people that if you lived a good life, you would get to heaven on your good works.
Well, this is the dialectic of the situation. This is part of the social gospel. If you do good works, you are guaranteed a place in heaven. You've got to lead a good life. It's a little bit different for Catholics. They're still expected to go to Mass on Sunday, observe their Easter duties and the Christmas duties, also to go to confession, because the thought of mortal sin is there. And don't forget, if you die in mortal sin, purgatory looms up. That is still very much in the Catholic Church.
And we should also say that Rome teaches that Muslims and Jews can get to heaven
Anybody.
without Jesus Christ, which of course we reject completely.
Hello friends, and thank you for joining us once again on this very fine radio station. Well, I think we come to the end of our journey through the popes of the 20th century. We're now in a pope of the 21st century, a man whose career I followed for over 20 years, Joseph Cardinal Ratzinger, better known to you as Pope Benedict XVI.
Now, we should also say that during the whole of the conclave season in April 2005, my father and I were discussing who would be the next pope. He thought it'd be an Italian, I thought it would be a German, i.e. Joseph Ratzinger, but he took over the reins from John Paul II, and don't we just remember the massive press coverage of the late Pope's death and the inauguration.
Well, it continued with his coronation,
Ratzinger's
didn't it?
inauguration. Please tell us some of your memories and thoughts of this new Pope.
Well, Joseph Ratzinger, I mean, as somebody said at the time, I think it was the editorial in the Times, when Ratzinger became the new Pope, it was an inside job, and that's an expression we have in England, an inside job when there's a crime. Certainly Joseph Ratzinger was an inside man. He had to study next to the previous Pope. I think he was there for 19 years. He actually lived in the Vatican apartment, so when he became Pope, he just moved his bedroom up one room and his study into the new study there. But yes, he was a faithful servant of Pope John Paul II. He was head of the Congregation of Faith, the old Holy Roman Office, of course, and with that power, he summoned many priests to Rome and castigated anyone who wasn't towing the party line, including Hans Küng, who I see had coffee and biscuits with him last weekend.
And we should also say that Joseph Ratzinger is very much a conservative.
May I take you to task there in a very kind way? You say he was a conservative, and I thought he was a conservative. But if Hans Küng is going to be brought on board now, who's very much into the role of feminism, psychiatry, Darwinism, interfaith, and all these other groups, this doesn't sound the sort of agenda that I thought Benedict XVI would be into. But who knows in this what's going on in the Catholic Church now? Maybe he was conservative, I don't know.
We should also say that the last four popes, excluding Benedict XVI, have also that evolution is more than a hypothesis, which is of great concern.
Yes.
So clearly that they do not hold to the biblical account of creation in the book of Genesis.
And certainly, if I just butt in, certainly that view would be agreed by Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, who presided over, a murder of millions of people with the simple ideas, well, what's the problem? If we're descended from the apes, who cares if millions of people are starved to death or worked to death or brutally beaten to death? I think the one pope who might have had some objections, this Pope Pius XII, whether he'd have said anything or not, I don't know.
And I believe you mentioned in a previous broadcast, you found an article, I think it was from Newsweek or somewhere, which mentioned Vatican apartments are being used to hide paedophile priests. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, this came out in Newsweek, a very reputable American magazine, that paedophile priests were hidden in Vatican apartments in Rome and other cities throughout Europe as well. I'm not surprised. I mean, I'm sure they own apartments all around the world. But yes, Joseph Ratzinger, as the cardinal of the doctrine, the Office of the Doctrine of Faith, was involved in hiding and shielding these priests. Probably gave them money as well. Who knows? Maybe he gave them passports like his predecessor, Bishop Hoodle, did in 1945.
Well, this has been a very special week of broadcasts dedicated to Roman Catholicism, and as you should know by now, both my father and I are ex-Roman Catholics, and we'd just like to say...
If I can just butt in very quickly, although we're out the Catholic Church, we're very much Vatican watchers, and there's a lot going on at the moment.
And what thoughts would you offer our listeners in the last minute?
What, Catholics?
Catholic listeners...
Get out of it.
And what sort of hope do you have? I mean, we know Catholics do come out of the Roman Catholic system. Us, for example. But what hope would you give to those?
Well, James, I would say, I know we're running out of time here. We've had 4 priests in the family. Catholicism runs through our blood. We would urge all Catholics to get out of it. Indeed, the angel in the book of Revelations get out of it 3 times. I would listen to that angel. It's not too late to get out of the Catholic Church now. Thank you.